Chapter 10, Weaving Tangled Threads of Mystery. As the day wore on, the bathing proposition came squarely before me, but I was so weak it seemed impossible to get out of bed, to say nothing of indulging in such exercise. However, after I had argued it out with myself and felt justified in refraining, that weird sentence floated back in a tantalizing way: "Oh, weaver of thy freedom, be faithful," and the echo of my promise, "I will be faithful," mocked me with the realization that my faithfulness had become a shrinking thing in the presence of the first demand made upon it. Then I determined to bathe regardless of consequences. It was well into the afternoon before this unexpected determination floated into speech, which brought forth the storm of protest I expected. While I realized how unreasonable my act must appear to those who could not understand, I was nonetheless determined upon its execution, if my strength permitted, which I really doubted. After arguing for some time, putting forth every reason, except the real one, why I should bathe, the point was yielded to me, with much misgiving in which I confess I secretly shared. After a few minutes I arose, at first in bed, then on the bedside, where I remained for some time weak and trembling, the object of Mrs. P.'s kind but most disapproving contemplation. Then, with a supreme effort I rose to my feet, expecting my weight to bear me down to the floor, but instead there seemed no weight. A force, suggestive of strong hands, held me so lightly that the act of walking was like treading on air and the putting of one foot before the other merely mechanical. This strength, which came to me as a thing apart, yet mine to use, remained with me throughout the bath and until I returned to bed, where the weakness and weariness came upon me as before. Yet an undercurrent of exhilaration remained until long after. That was rather an unusual bath in more ways than one. When the water was turned on, it came with a sizzling sound, which I could hear through the open door between my bedroom and bathroom before going in. I paid very little attention to it, but fancy my surprise when I stepped into it, expecting it to be cold, and found it almost uncomfortably hot. I came near jumping out, so unexpected was the shock. I never use warm or hot baths, except the Turkish, therefore there was no connection, no provision made for heating the water, rendering it impossible for the water to have been heated without my knowledge, nor was this the only time the water was heated by the same process. No explanation was made as to the modus operandi of the heating. Of course, we all know a subnormal temperature produces the illusion of heat, but what about the sizzling sound? Of course, some of our Orthodox friends may suggest my proximity to a locality where such conditions prevail as a natural sequence, but, as I am leaving much of what I am writing to the construction of anyone who cares to assume the responsibility, I will not attempt an explanation where none has been given to me, feeling that every human being has as much right to his or her opinions as I have to mine. I am simply relating these incidents, as they came to me, painfully personal though they are, because that which gave them to me insists that they were not given for me alone, so I am just passing them along so others may know that these manifestations are possible for all who care to investigate for themselves, and abide by the requirements. How changed the whole world seemed. Instead of joyous anticipation at the coming of my beloved in the evening, I dreaded his coming with a guilty sense of deception, feeling that I would rather have died any death than to have lived to face him, a living exemplification of prevarication, illusion, madness, or what not. Yet when he came, my unrest vanished before the frank joyousness of his smile, which said, plainer than words, how pleased he was that the night had passed without taking me with it. I so wanted to explain to him, tell him just how it was, but he was a free thinker and not believing, would not understand. So, perforce, I refrained, leaving him to place his own construction on it. He made no reference to it, nor did I. As the days went on, I took my baths without interference, as their strength-giving and refreshing effect was patent to all, for which I was very grateful, as the baths gave many delightful diversions. Invisible hands would sometimes playfully dash the water over me, even into my face and over my hair, laughing the while in a light, mirthful way, while glimpses of faces came and went, ever-changing, and cold breezes would persist until I would come out of the water shivering, as light-hearted and carefree as a child at play. The impression was always that of children or fairies at play, in which I believed as a child, and I remember wondering if some such experience as this had not given rise to these wonderful stories which are so appealing and fascinating to the childish imagination, who knows? Then dawned another Tuesday. A cloudy, rainy day, but to me it was very beautiful, as I awaited the coming of the night, as the fulfillment of the promise, for which I had worked and waited, with a purpose and patience that was new to my nature. As the night came down, the very atmosphere seemed glorified, seemed to caress me, and my whole being breathed responsiveness, as I waited in absolute certainty for that which long delayed its coming, for that which came not. How endless the night seemed as I lay awake quivering with expectancy, counting every hour as the clock struck, feeling that when it struck again, I would not be there to count. Still I waited for the call for which I felt myself ready in every way, just waited until the dawn came and then the sunrise. It is much to realize just how blank and empty life can really be. It seemed utterly impossible to take up the burden again, to act in accordance with the persistent requirements which my promise of faithfulness involved. The temptation to denounce it all was strong upon me. It seemed some hallucination or delusion was chaining me to itself, that I had to free myself of it, and I would. Rash were the resolves I made and meant to abide by. Chief among these was, that I would get up out of bed, that I would never listen to another voice and never do another thing that was included in my promise of faithfulness. This inharmonious mood lasted until well into the afternoon, until time for the bath, which I had promised myself, in all seriousness, that I would not take. Then the feeling of uneasiness, the sensation of something important being left undone, began tantalizing me. As I was trying to be firm in my resistance, I could feel hands pushed under between me and the mattress, impelling me upward, as though suggesting that I get up. This made me more determined than ever in my resistance. I simply had had enough of having my seriousness trifled with. Suddenly something lifted me up, as though I were a feather, and stood me with emphasis on the floor. In obedience to it, I marched into the bathroom and stepped into the tub. I had passed again under the dominance of that mysterious force from which there seemed to be no escape, and the strangest part was that while really under it there was no desire to have it otherwise. As Z had said I would not bathe, there was no water turned on, so I took the hose which I attached and used in preference to the regular spray, as it shared less of the bath with the floor, and proceeded. As I sat with the water pouring over me, my attention was attracted to something moving at the point where the hose ejected the water. I looked at it closely, but could see nothing but a miniature reflection of my face, what anyone would see, and proceeded with the showering, but the attraction increased with such absorbing insistence, that I again took the hose firmly in my hand and held it near my eyes, with the same result, only to have the same irresistible attraction hold me, when I began bathing again. This time I held it up with the resolve that I would either allay its disturbing attractiveness or leave the bath, feeling that possibly this mode of bathing was not entirely in favor with that under whose direction it was being taken, and this was being done to cause me to change it, and not having altogether recovered from my attack of disobedience, I did not care especially whether it pleased or not. Yes, there was the miniature reflection of my face in the water, but there was something else. Reflected above the head was something white, which upon close scrutiny appeared as a scroll in the process of folding and unfolding. Suspended from it, hanging directly, reflected, in front of my face, parallel with my mouth, was a perfectly round, black ball about 2 inches in diameter, jumping as though suspended by a rubber cord. As I viewed it in astonishment, a voice said,
"When it touches your mouth, you will die."
This extraordinary statement shocked me for a moment, but inspired by its potentiality I sat before it, expecting that any moment might bring the collision, which I had neither the power nor the wish to avoid. The ball swayed back and forth, all but touching me, bounding lightly away only to repeat the performance, while I watched it eagerly for some time, until I again felt that my seriousness was being trifled with and left the bath with something akin to resentment in my heart. I was terribly unhappy. The reflection of that white, ever-folding and unfolding scroll, with the little bounding black ball, was the most persistent of all the phenomena that came to me, and really uninteresting after the first few times. It was often reflected in water or wine as I turned the glass up to drink, nearly always at the end of the hose as I bathed. When looking in a mirror it was as distinctly discernible as my face. However, I never saw it except as a reflection in which my face shared. Rarely a day passed that I did not see it in some form, yet the scroll never quite unwound, nor did the little ball, as near as it came, ever touch my mouth. What purpose it served I do not know, unless it was to keep the consciousness of approaching death ever in my mind, which, at that time, seemed the necessary condition, rendering me receptive to what subsequently followed. As the days went on, I grew no better, no worse, just remained at the dead level of monotony, fever fluctuating around a half degree when the temperature was not subnormal. I realized that I was not sick in the generally accepted term, but at times I was so weak I could hardly raise my hands. My limbs, hands, arms, and sometimes my entire body would have a feeling of numbness, such as when one's foot goes to sleep, as the children say. Nothing strengthened me, although I took the medicines prescribed by the doctors, rigidly, I won't say uncomplainingly. I tried to do everything that was required of me by the material as well as spiritual forces, which clashed, at times, very disagreeably. There seemed a force greater than the most potent medicines holding me in just the condition that best served the purpose of these manifestations. I seemed an intermundane creature, suspended, as it were, between life and so-called death, a receiving station. A creature of both worlds, yet of neither, and reader, please don't envy me. Voices would come prognosticating things that did not eventuate, telling strange, weird and wonderful stories, all of which I, at first, believed. Then a new strength grew up within me, discrimination, making my perception so strong that I could not only discriminate between the voices of truth and deception, but could feel the approach of an undesirable presence, which I met with the command to depart, and in no sense was this command violated. However, in a few instances the presence would stop and plead to be permitted to come nearer, as though it could be greatly helped thereby, but that a still small voice within permitted no such intimacies. When I had become what one might term superior to these deceptions, there were great demonstrations of joy in the spirit world, as though I had made a great advance, as though I had won a hard-fought battle. I shared in these rejoicings, feeling that perhaps this was my passport to that far country, into which my entry had been so grievously delayed, and half expecting to enter then and there, while the soft music fell upon me like a benediction. Then the voices, the rejoicings, the music ceased, and I waited. Just waited on the ragged edge of quivering expectancy in the stillness of the night. Chapter 11, The Choir Invisible. The best music is not complete, it ever suggests something beyond, it is only a symbol of a spiritual condition which we seek to attain. Beethoven. I was so depressed, weak and listless the next day that, despite my protestations, a trained nurse was installed. From the beginning, it was one of the doctor's recommendations that I refused to comply with, feeling in advance resentment for the constant presence of a human being, who might interfere with my companionable relations with the beings of the shadow realms, which I preferred to the mundane, feeling that I belonged more to the other side of life than to this. But really her presence made little or no difference, as she could not see what I saw nor hear what I heard, she was not a receiving station, therefore could not be brought into conscious contact with the finer forces. Nevertheless, I resented her and was not altogether careful about concealing it. Her respect for duty was most abnormally developed, as she administered according to the doctor's directions with an insistence that precluded the omission of a single pill. I stoically took her doses, just as I did the attentions which she felt it was her duty to bestow, and I always added a few drops of that insidious soul poison, self-pity. My little dog shared my resentment at her coming, to such an extent that he had to be sent away and given into the care of a friend, where he had every care and comfort and was brought for a daily visit to me, at which times he was either joyous in his demonstrations, or would not come near me, evidencing a fear that made him very cautious in even wagging his tail at a safe distance. Sometimes, forgetful of caution, he would run and jump on the bed, but when he noted the object of his disapproval, he would hurriedly leap off and either go under the bed, or to the farthest corner of the room, leaving no question as to his ability to see and understand that which, to mortal senses, was not discernible. He seemed to be the only thing in the world that understood, yet he denied me the sympathy of his understanding. I was not long in realizing that I was violating one of the strictest injunctions of my promise of faithfulness, in mental attitude where the nurse was concerned, and made amends accordingly, which gave me the sensation of another victory won, in which the invisible forces made their approval felt. It was a calm, still, moonlit night, the kind that seems to call one to come out under the stars and just weave dreams in harmony with its tenderness and beauty. I had fallen under the spell of it and was just listlessly dreaming, half thinking. It seemed I had attained a fuller sense of harmony with the higher forces, that in some way I was lifted up to a higher consciousness than I had before realized, to a different vibration. Soft, quivering, indefinable life seemed to interpenetrate the atmosphere with the suggestion as of soundless music, and a subnormal stillness was upon everything, as I lay in happy restfulness within it. Then suddenly, there burst on the stillness, music the like of which I had never heard. The whole invisible world seemed a gigantic orchestra, yet there was something so soft about the music, That breathing sounded above it as a profane thing in that ethereal atmosphere. It was spontaneous music without the sound of the instrument, voices without the effort of production, just concentrated harmony sinking into the soul, touching a chord so responsive that it seemed a soul communion rather than a thing apart, the real music, of which the mundane is only a shadow. I had never before heard anything so wonderful as on this occasion, although it was really not my first audience to the choir invisible. I remember some years ago, I was very ill with measles complicated by pneumonia, a necrological combination, at best. Especially so, as I was no longer a child. All hope of recovery had been abandoned by my father, and the physician who sat through the night watches, hoping against hope. It was a cold January night, and a blizzard, accompanied by sleet and snow, was wildly sweeping the country and howling uproariously. I was supposed to be unconscious, but I heard the wind as it whistled, shrieked and drove against the shutters, yet above all, soft, zephyr-like music, was as perceptible and distinct as though nothing broke the stillness. Even now, I remember the very tunes and have often tried to cage them on the piano, but when I seek most ardently, they elude me most effectively. All night long the duet of music and storm played on, one raging in its fury, the other soft as the silence, yet each distinctly audible. When the night was all but giving way to day, the doctor felt my pulse, professionally at first, then eagerly, motioning to my father to come nearer, which he did, waiting for the verdict. 1 long minute they stood, both eagerly watching my face. "She will live," said the doctor solemnly, turning to my father, who replied ardently, "Thank God," as my eyes opened in perfect consciousness and I murmured, such music, which caused my father to look disappointed, as he considered me delirious, but the doctor reassured him. That is not unusual in her condition. No one seemed to understand when I made reference to the music I had heard, so I gradually refrained from speaking of it, storing it away in the casket of sweet, sacred memories where it has since remained. Yet compared to the music I had just heard, it seemed so insignificant, it was hardly worth remembering. It was like the sun shutting out the brilliance of the stars. I fully realize that, to one who does not understand, this music is a mystical unreality, but to the person hearing it, it is more than real. On waking in the morning, I was possessed with an almost uncontrollable desire to share my knowledge of the existence of such music. I wanted to tell someone about it, it was too wonderful a thing to be selfish about. The constraint which advisability placed upon me made me so unhappy that, in my heart, I cried out against the force that held my soul in one world and left my body in the other, a creature of the earth life, a part of it and apart from it. While I did not fail to realize that, in this great moral conflict, we must go forth alone, I also realized that it was a grand sentiment but a dreary practice. I deplored being hedged in, as it were, by the materialism of the spiritually blind that surrounded me, feeling that there must be someone, somewhere, who could understand, but such a one seemed not amongst my acquaintances. I wished my fiancé was less dogmatic on the subject, but to mention it in his presence was like touching a match to a powder magazine. While I deployed this, I tried to be reasonable and did not resent it, as I knew if conditions were reversed and, in the days of my materialism, he had come to me with such stories, I fear my toleration would not have been so elastic as his had proven itself. At times, however, I brooded over the conviction that, had he chosen he could have enlightened me on the subject, or at least its theories, as I recalled having heard him relate, in derision, incidents of what he termed spiritualistic phenomena. Knowing nothing of the subject, it never especially appealed to me and rather subconsciously I assumed his attitude toward it. All religions were alike to us, the metaphysics of the masses, as Schopenhauer puts it. But now how different. I knew I had heard music not of the earth, but who would believe it? Then I wrestled with self-pity, feeling that I was alone, that alone I drifted on the relentless seas of other realms, to sink or swim as my own strength might determine. This was really not very far from the truth, but it is not nearly so tragic as it then seemed. While in this unenviable frame of mind, a friend, Mrs. S., came in, and I was more than glad to see her, as she is of that rare companionable temperament, whose very presence exudes sympathetic understanding. With a cheery, "How are you, dear?" she came directly to the bed and sat down beside me. Demonstrating my pleasure at her coming, I laid my hand caressingly on her arm. In an instant a strong force, as of an invisible hand, pressed mine down on her arm, with such emphasis, that it was perceived by her. We looked at each other with understanding and then spoke freely of that which had long been calling for human understanding. She did not seem to regard my experiences as especially wonderful or unreasonable, and, above all, she did not glare at me as though she considered me quite mad, for which I covered her with the mantle of my gratitude and pulled her face down to mine and kissed it, as the invisible forces began clattering away on the metal bedstead as though it were a telegraph battery. Looking at me, smilingly she said, "I hear them," as she arose to give place to newly arrived visitors, who could not see, feel, hear or understand, and looked at her strangely when she shivered and said, "It is like cold storage in here, I'm freezing." While perspiring and fanning themselves, they started an argument about the heat of the day, suggesting that she must be ill to feel cold in such torrid weather. I paid the newly arrived guests little attention. I was reveling in the satisfaction of having heard at least one human being admit the existence of spirits, as she termed them. It is impossible to conceive what this little grain of sympathy and understanding meant to one so utterly deprived of both. In the evening when my fiancé came, he was delighted that my condition was so improved, and foresaw that I would be well in a few days if such improvement continued. I refrained from mentioning the cause, but assured him that I was feeling splendidly, and we chatted unreservedly of things that suggested themselves, without intruding upon the subject that had come like the serpent in Eden, and imparted to me wisdom of which he knew nothing, and which formed a kind of intangible barrier that both recognized silently and tried to ignore. In the presence of his love and solicitude, I would forget that I had affianced myself to death, that I belonged to another world. When he was with me, the touch of his hand, the radiating aura of his love, his magnetism, made me want to live and love and sing with him always beside me, we, two, together, but when he went away, lacking the magnetism of his presence, I would again fall under the domination of the force that held me in willing readiness to pass beyond this realm. Listening to the choir invisible, my soul would lift above the mundane, and I would close my eyes in anguish at the delay, as a bride might whose bridegroom delayed his coming. Chapter 12, Defining Soul and Body. And there are diversities of operations, but it is the same God that worketh all in all. But the manifestation of the Spirit is given to every man to profit withal. For to one is given by the Spirit the word of wisdom, to another, the word of knowledge by the same Spirit. To another the working of miracles, to another prophecy, to another discerning of spirits, to another, diverse kinds of tongues, to another, the interpretation of tongues. But all this worketh that one and the selfsame Spirit, dividing to every man severally as he will. I could not sleep, so heavily did depression weigh upon me. I was tired of waiting and there was revolt in my soul against what seemed trivial requirements and needless delay. A reproving voice intruded itself into my rebellious consciousness.
Why do you permit such thoughts to dominate you?
I am tired of life and everything in it, I replied, as petulantly as I felt.
Every time you fall into such vibrations you move the time of your release further away.
Well, I'll just live then, I snapped. I am ready and willing to die, but I shall not remain here forever waiting to do so. I shall get up tomorrow and try to forget that I was ever identified with such a torturing mystery.
Hush, child, you know not of what you speak.
Then why don't you explain it to me instead of leaving me harassed by uncertainty and torn by its attending tortures?
To know life, you must live, to know death you must die.
But there is no death, I insisted.
It is the name by which the birth into the higher life, the real life, is recognized.
Tell me about it, won't you? I pleaded with new interest.
To know death you must die.
Repeated the voice so impressively that a shiver ran over me, for the very presence of death seemed in the room, as with awe I listened for the voice to further enlighten me concerning death, the hidden, dark way between the threshold and the light. Instead, I heard the night birds singing and crickets chirping in a dismal sort of way, and realizing that the interview was over I repeated dreamily to myself, trying to realize its import. To know death you must die. The next morning, I was awakened by a magnificent rendition from Il Trovatore in Italian. So natural did it seem, that I looked about the room half expecting to see the singer, but the song ended almost before I could appreciate the beauty of it. I listened a long time, hoping for its return, but it had not come when my attention was diverted by the arrival from Dallas of an immense express package, which proved to be roses and ferns sufficient to decorate a banquet hall. With gratitude to the sender for thus indulging my love for flowers, I had the box put on the bed so I could help take them out and arrange them as fancy might dictate. With this end in view, I had all my vases, some rare and beautiful, brought and placed in waiting for the floral burden. Pedestals, impromptu and otherwise, were arranged about the room. Statues were removed to give place to flower-laden vases, even the jardinières were filled to overflowing. All day long I reveled in this gift from nature's storehouse of loveliness, and when the night came, the scent of the sleeping roses mingled their fragrance with my dreams. Suddenly I was awakened, wide awake without any apparent cause. After listening for a few minutes into the silence, without hearing anything I looked about but could see nothing and decided that I had only awakened just as anyone might. After breathing deeply of the scent of the roses, I would have slept again, but a voice which seemed nearer than usual said firmly,
Arise and move that table to your bedside.
I heard but doubted the evidence of my hearing, as the onyx table alone was beyond the capacity of my strength, but now that it was heavily laden with vases, filled with flowers, it was not to be considered. To move it would be to break the vases, and my mind's ears seemed to hear in advance the crash that would arouse the dragon nurse. And what a time I would have explaining to her. Thus, hesitating, I remained in bed in a semi-reclining position, resting on one elbow, looking hopelessly toward the table and then at the face of the sleeping nurse, whom I could not see very well. The sound of her deep, regular breathing, however, was more reassuring than the sight of her face would have been. Reluctantly obeying a force that was stronger than my inclination to disobey, I arose cautiously, creeping on tiptoe to the table with fear and trembling for the lives of my vases, and thinking of the humiliation to myself when the nurse should arise in the execution of her duty. I stood for a moment beside the table, tears welling up into my eyes at the tyranny of a force that not only compelled me to attempt the impossible, but to destroy my treasured vases which held the fragrant offering that had come to gladden my tired senses. While thus hesitating, I could feel the force pressing me, very pronouncedly, bearing heavily upon me, pushing me nearer and nearer the table until I touched it with my body. Then, in the desperation of accepting the inevitable, I placed both hands upon its sides, testing it for the safest and most effective hold. To my surprise as well as relief, it lifted lightly and floated gently to the bedside without disarranging as much as a rose, leaving me standing in amazement just where I had stood when I placed my hands upon it, and too much relieved that no harm had come to the vases to fully appreciate the wonder of the performance. After standing in petrified amazement for some minutes with my eyes fixed upon the table, I slowly walked over and again stood by it, and being very weak, put one hand on it to steady myself, but quickly removed it, as there was a distinct shock as of electricity, which caused me to refrain from further direct contact with it. A voice came in a tone deep with seriousness.
Choose a red rose and white one. The red one you will hold in your right hand, the white in your left.
This I did, and the voice commanded,
Now get into bed.
Obedience was never one of my virtues, even as a child, and I resented its exactions upon any circumstances. Therefore, I got into the bed slowly, deliberately, arranging my pillows with exaggerated precision despite the roses in my hands, feeling that I should be requested to do these things, not commanded. Finally, I lay down with a red rose crushed in my right hand and a white one in my left, wondering what would be the next requirement or what would be the outcome of what the night had already required. I was so weak and tired that I did not prognosticate very long, as I felt sleep coming gently down and shutting out all perplexities. This condition was instantly and most effectively relieved by the calm announcement.
You are going to petrify tonight.
What? I cried in alarm, echoing petrify, but no further explanation was vouchsafed. What did you say? I called again and again into the unresponsive blackness, and even while I listened a coldness began creeping upon me and continued ever increasing until I felt that I was freezing. I did everything I could to shake it off, feeling that I was a victim of suggestion. I told myself in all seriousness that I was not cold at all but was instead comfortably warm, and honestly tried to feel myself so, even when the sense of coldness became so intense that to deny it was unreasonable. I could have cried out for cover, though the night was hot, with a sultry threatening of rain in the atmosphere and not a breath of air stirring. I looked about the room, but the semi-darkness showed it to be normal except for a frosty mist that was hanging about with a bluish light scintillating and spreading itself in pale illumination. The table stood beside the bed, and as if to reassure myself, to prove its presence, I reached out my hand, still retaining the rose, and took a piece of fern that lay loosely upon it and pressed it into my hair, which was rather loose and disheveled about my face. As my hair generally is at night, I like to sleep with it unconfined. I do not remember that I had any defined motive in the act unless it was the subconscious desire for material confirmation of that which was in the act of transpiring. A moment later I could move neither hand nor foot, could not move a muscle in my body as it became rigid, the eyes wide open and the power of speech gone. I think I must have been rather terrified or distressed for an instant, for I remember the impulse of tearing myself away from it, which gradually gave place to resignation and observation. The very atmosphere in the room seemed electrified, alive, and out of its quivering vibrations came the form of my mother, who stood by the bedside looking down upon me lovingly and tenderly with great illuminated eyes. She wore a grey dressing gown, which I recognized as the one she had worn when last I saw her in the earth life. In her hand she held a gorgeous white flower, stretching it toward me, almost touching my face with it. The fragrance seemed to fill the entire room, neutralizing, overpowering that of the earth flowers, and my mood blended into the perfect harmony of the offering. I wanted to reach out and take the flower from her, but conscious of the impotency of my hand, manacled by some strange power, I could only glance at it as it lay out from me, showing tiny glimpses of crushed red petals between the clasped fingers. So lifelike did she seem that the impulse was strong upon me to kiss her and tell her how glad I was that she had come, but this being impossible, I cried out mentally, "Mama, little mama, speak to me."
The body is to the soul what the flower is to the fragrance.
She whispered softly and smilingly, and then slowly faded away while still I was looking at the place where she had stood, my soul calling to her to come back, though the cold was stiffening my body and freezing my blood. Then I fell to wondering if clothes and flowers really have souls that pass into other realms, and are these still the possessions of those who own them in the earth life? Do they have souls at all? Was there really no end to perplexing problems to press in upon one from every side? My attention was diverted by Mian standing before me, plainer and more illuminated than I ever had seen him before. I called out to him, "Mian, what is the matter, am I dying?" He looked into my eyes steadily and ignoring my question said impressively,
"Truth stands unveiled before thee, let it not pass unobserved."
And with his steady gaze upon me, resistance and perplexities gave way and I began trying to analyze my predicament as the cold waves, like a rising tide, every surge of which was perceptible, ebbed nearer and nearer life's center. Then, as it were, I felt them touch, and stiffened as the full tide of insensibility enveloped me physically while mentally, I grew proportionately more active and discerning. I could no longer see Mian but felt that he was near, still looking at me with sternness in his eyes and command in his attitude, impelling me to a discernment that, inferring from his words and attitude, was very essential. Then I felt myself to be absolutely alone, alone with the mystery of myself, the roses and the cold. Suddenly I was conscious of the most compelling sensation I ever felt. I was a thing apart from the cold, frozen body, which seemed a heavy wall surrounding me as though I were wrapped in something cold and heavy. I realized an independence of it, an existence without it, and half resented it as a thing that bound me, that interfered with my freedom. As I acknowledged this to myself, the I principle, or inner strength, grew in power until it seemed to reach out beyond the cold, useless exterior and meet, in a cooperative sense, a greater strength or power. I could feel the two meeting, touching, as it were, through the dead coldness of the physical body which had become as nothing. Then came the gradual birth of a grand sensation, a merging of the strength within and that without, blending, powerful in its cooperation. I felt that this great new power was mine, mine to use as I elected, mine to draw upon at will. A few seconds later I perceived that the physical body was moving and I within it, as a thing apart, was being lifted by the cooperative strength of this within and without power. The body was as insensible as a stone with a stone's cold heaviness, but it moved lightly up, up, slowly, cautiously, until within a few inches of the ceiling where it stopped. While it was thus suspended, this outer and inner strength came together more pronouncedly and forcibly, as if to further define and cement their oneness of power and independence of the body. Then the I, the ego, looked with analysis upon its relationship with its physical environment of which it had always deemed itself a part, or rather a whole, and came to the conclusion that the soul and body are two separate entities, that the soul is independent of the body and uses it only for the convenience of functioning while in the earth life. The body is only molded clay, the soul or spirit is the real life, the life everlasting. When this conviction was full upon me, a voice came crying joyously,
"It is well, it is well."
and many spirits joined in the demonstrations of rejoicing that I had not permitted this unveiled truth to pass unobserved, and a great exultation possessed me as the body was gently lowered on the bed, head on pillow, more perfectly adjusted than before the ascent. It is impossible to convey any idea of a condition so out of harmony with the automatic or involuntary actions of physical life, but suffice it to say, it was wonderful, this drawing the line between soul and body, defining it, feeling that the soul recognizes not only itself but a cooperative relationship too new and mysterious to be either fully understood or explained. Veritably, it seemed to recognize itself as a part of God, one with all power. Then slowly the cold began giving way to warm, comfortable life, to the accompaniment of a prickling, stinging sensation not unlike when one's foot goes to sleep. My body was miserably stiff and uncomfortable as sensibility returned, but I was so tired that although the dawn had come, I drifted into the slumber that consumes weariness, the chilly memory of the night being obliterated for the time being. Long after sunrise, when I opened my eyes, there were the material footprints, the flower-laden table sat beside the bed. In my right hand was a crushed rose of red, in my left one of white, and a sprig of fern was tangled in my hair.